There is a lot in this book. Monster Kids goes over goes over Pokemania. So the late 90s into the early 2000s when Pokemon was just everywhere. We talk about the licensing, the anime, merchandising, a little bit about the games, and some of the competitors that came along. But let's start off with the games because that's what I care about the most. I was actually expecting to read more about the video games in this, but that really wasn't what happened, and I'm okay with that. I learned an awful lot about just the different Pokemon clones, the different animes that were kind of turned into Pokemon clones, or at least attempted to be turned into Pokemon clones. There's so much in here. But we start off with kind of the origins of the Pokemon franchise. So, like the first and second generation Pokemon Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow. I didn't know that Blue was actually a patch for kind of improvements that were made to Pokemon Red and Green. This was all on the Japanese release, by the way. And that when it came over here to the United States, we basically got the patch with Pokemon Blue. That was kind of cool to read about and everything. It was something I didn't know because I didn't really bother to ever look any of that stuff up and find out. And it also had never really occurred to me that Pokemon, well, the first and second generation of Pokemon games kind of formed a complete story. You had the first one where you basically play as Red, or whatever you want to name your character, and he goes on his journey, becomes the Pokemon Master, and then in the second generation, you play as somebody trying to beat Red, and that is sort of bringing the whole story full circle, or at least bringing Red's story full circle. So that was kind of cool to read about all of that stuff, and to see how that was kind of how it was supposed to end. But it didn't, of course, and we still have Pokemon games today. I also didn't know too much about the Digimon or Yu-Gi-Oh games, and there's a pretty good reason for that. They were not rolled out in the United States as well, and a lot of the early Yu-Gi-Oh games were not very good at all. And from what I remember of the Digimon game that I played, just one of them, it wasn't all that great either. It was very interesting to find out that a lot of the really good Digimon games were on a console that I had never heard of back in the 90s and the 2000s. They were on the Wonder Swan. I had no idea I was going to be reading about the Wonder Swan when I picked this up, and that was kind of a fun thing to read about. The only one that I ever played for Digimon games was on the PS1, and that's about all I could tell you about it. I played it on the PS1. The one that is brought up that I was really glad that got brought up was the Monster Rancher games. I love the Monster Rancher games, especially 3. That's just me, of course. And they were kind of awesome, like really, really awesome. But I think Daniel's kind of right about them. They're mostly cult classics now, and a lot of that has to do with their reliance on other physical media. Once physical media is gone, the games kind of lose their novelty, because you needed to have a bunch of CDs or DVDs from around the time that the game came out in order to spawn more monsters and get the more creative ones. Pokemon kind of came out at a really important time for anime in the United States. If you, I guess it's not really so much weird anymore because it kind of feels like a lot of people have similar stories. But anime was one of those things that was not mainstream. It was kind of kind of a cult in its own. Not really a cult, but kind of a niche in its own. You had to know about it back in the early and mid '90s. You would end up like finding stuff at Suncoast and just kind of taking a chance on it because there was no internet to really know if anything was good or not. You kind of had to, at least in my experience, you had to go to the library and look this stuff up because that was the only way you could get online. And yeah, so the Pokemon anime and the movies, they kind of are a major focus on a lot of the book here. And they kind of go into how the Pokemon franchise got expanded beyond the games and kind of took over pop culture for about 5 to 7 years. Other shows and other animes are brought up as well. God, I'm getting these confused. Other shows and other movies are brought up. Gosh, stick with your script here, Paul. But they get brought up, and they kind of are. Daniel does a good job of explaining why they just didn't do as well as Pokemon did. We kind of chart the rise of anime on television. I was in school, high school around this time when Toonami kind of became available to me. Before that, a lot of the shows that you could watch, like Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, they weren't necessarily syndicated, and you had to like wake up ridiculously early in order to see them. I remember waking up at like 5:30 on a Saturday in order to see Dragon Ball, and then like as a cliffhanger episode, I was all excited to see what happened on the next episode. Then all of a sudden it switches to Dragon Ball Z, and you have a whole bunch of new characters and everything, and you have no idea what's happening. Anime was kind of hamstrung because it was thrown on at weird times. I think Ronin Warriors was on at like 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning on weekdays, so like nobody saw it, at least in my area. But then when Toonami came out, it kind of not really lent it credibility, but made it go a little bit more mainstream so more people could see this. You also had Pokemon being on like right after school. I think it was on at like 2:30 or 3 o'clock. So it was on right after school got out. Then they talk about the localization process for a whole bunch of other anime. This was nothing new. Like, animes got butchered repeatedly throughout the 80s and in the 90s and even into the 2000s. Just look at something like Voltron, which does not exist. It really didn't exist until 3 separate animes were bought and cobbled together into Voltron. You had the same thing with Robotech. That did not exist as a whole thing until it was cobbled together and brought to the United States. Yeah, stuff like this has happened all the time. And then in the 2000s, in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had stuff trying to be turned into Pokemon, which I thought was really interesting. I had never really thought about that before. Like, the idea of a Pokemon clone had never really occurred to me. But yeah, reading about all these different animes that were not supposed to be Pokemon and hearing about the localization process of how they kind of got turned into that or forced into that mold was fascinating to me. And then you read about how later on they sort of got rediscovered and people could see them for what they were really supposed to be. That was kind of cool to know all about that stuff. And that's something else that's happened with many different shows. Oh gosh, what was it? I know it as Battle of the Planets, but that's not the real name for it. I'd have to go look it up. But, sorry about that. Yeah, Battle of the Planets was one that kind of got messed up like that. Seeing what Robotech was supposed to be and learning about the different shows that went into that. Well, it's not important. There were a lot of them that got kind of butchered and then eventually were released in their original form later on in the really like the mid to late 2000s, as soon as DVDs kind of became more available and that sort of thing. Since I ran a little long on the last time, we'll try to wrap this one up. The merchandising was a very large part of this book. Everything got licensed products back then, especially with Pokemon. That one's is obviously the biggest focus because that kind of came first. And yeah, you had the video games, you had anime, you had theatrical movies that were released, you had the trading card game, you had video games for the trading card game, like everything. You could not, like if you walk through a toy aisle or any retail store, you would accidentally run into Pokemon themed stuff. It was just everywhere. And it reminded me an awful lot of, oh god, I think he goes by something else now, but it was Toy Galaxy. He talks about just how in the 80s, like the cartoons were a marketing tool to get you to buy all of the other stuff, like the toys, the games, lunch boxes, bed sheets, that sort of thing. And that kind of felt, with Pokemon, it kind of felt like a revival of that idea, where you had just a whole bunch of different stuff trying to squeeze as much money out of this property as you possibly could. And for a period, it really worked. And you had other people trying to do the same thing with Digimon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, that sort of thing. I don't remember some of those were just like the major ones that were brought up. I don't remember a lot of other anime that did that as well. I do know that there were card games for everything, just absolutely everything. And most of them didn't last very long. Some of the weird ones that I know of, there's a SimCity card game, there's a Dragon Ball Z card game. There were just weird card games that you wouldn't expect, but sort of the bigger ones, like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, and that sort of thing, they kind of stuck around. I didn't know that Pokemon was originally released through Wizards of the Coast, so that was kind of cool to read about. But yeah, this whole thing about oh yeah, and the manga. Sorry, he talks about a bunch of different manga in here, and they range from kind of what you would expect, just retelling the story of the anime, to being like oddly adult and not coming to the United States, or being discontinued after the games got really popular. He also talks about the different companies and everything that got their hands in it, like Wizard of the Coast, and that's stuff like that. But yeah, it just, this whole thing, when he got into the marketing and the merchandising and everything, it reminded me of stuff like He-Man, G.I. Joe, Transformers, and those other properties from the 80s. And it's kind of interesting to see how this stuff goes in cycles like that. I just found all of that stuff like really relatable, and just, it was a part that I really understood quite well as I was reading through this. There are a lot of franchises that are brought up in this that were either forced into being competitors to Pokemon or were real competitors to them. And they get a lot of time to be talked about, but some of the bigger ones were Digimon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Those are kind of like the two big examples that Daniel brings up. Some only competed against Pokemon in like the anime department. Others tried to go toe to toe with them in both anime and video games. Others tried to emulate exactly what they did, but they just kind of fell short. Digimon was the big one, though. They were the ones that, had their weekly show at first. They had their anime, and They had their video games, which were not as good. I don't think the trading card game ever came over, but it was very interesting to read about just how Digimon was very obviously set up to be that competitor to Pokemon, and how they kind of were just outgunned in what was happening. They also bring up, like, so Digimon had like a fighting game, Tamagotchi type game. So like a virtual pet fighter, which I had to have known about back then, but just don't remember anything about it. Certain things like Monster Rancher, like Digimon, they have that similar monsters fighting each other mechanic that was done. And then there are some that have like a collecting part to the franchise that don't really line up with what Pokemon was doing. Something like Monster Rancher was never really built around collecting a bunch of different monsters. Digimon wasn't really like that either. But then you had something like Yu-Gi-Oh!, where it eventually evolved into them collecting cards and having monsters fight and that sort of thing. The origin of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was way more interesting, how it started off as something completely different and slowly turned into what it is now, like what we would recognize it now, and how the anime kind of caught on and became pretty popular. I had no idea about Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, but I was, like a lot of these franchises, I was starting to move into other stuff. That doesn't mean that they weren't important or anything like that. That just means I had other stuff going on at the time. But reading about all these different competitors, what they tried to do, how they either faltered or just didn't reach the heights of Pokemon, it was very interesting. I also liked how he brought up that, I'll get into this one later. You know what, I'll save that for the next section. This was the part of the book that I think Daniel did an excellent job on, talking about how the media saw this as the end of kind of the Pokemon fad, and laying out how they were always seemingly looking for the next childhood thing that was, wow, I kind of messed that one up. They were always kind of looking for the next thing that was going to top Pokemon. And this was really like the mainstream media and whatnot, and how it was kind of driving that narrative that, okay, Pokemon's dead, now all the kids are going to be focused on this. When it wasn't really true exactly. He kind of pins this around 2003, when the anime's second season ended, Pokemon Crystal had been released, and the hype surrounding like the whole market of Pokemon, the market that Pokemon had created, was kind of starting to diminish, mostly because it was just flooded with similar products, and some kids had just kind of moved on to other stuff. He brings up how kind of the media had been doing this for a while. They'd been declaring the death of Pokemon, and they had sort of pegged Yu-Gi-Oh! As the thing that was going to take over for it. And I'm sure people can debate whether or not that's true, but that's sort of what Daniel's research had shown. It wasn't so much the gaming media that was doing this. The gaming media was still following the games and everything and reporting on that. Most of what Daniel's examples are come from sort of like the more traditional media, so like newspapers and like TV and everything like that. The internet was still kind of in its infancy in the early 2000s, and even though there were like fan sites and everything for Pokemon, they really weren't what they are now. The media used kind of like the declining box office sales for the animes to kind of point out how, Pokemon was dead, which, when it comes down from the heights that it was at, sure, it kind of looks that way, but it never went away. It just sort of fell down to a little bit lower plateau. And Daniel does a good job of kind of pointing this out by saying, okay, the first generation Pokemon games sold 40 million. Second generation came in and sold roughly about 30 million. So you can see that there was some decline in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the fad was over. That just means you weren't selling 40 to 50 million of something anymore. You were only selling in the 30 millions. It's very interesting to see that. And he also brings up how the marketing for the different movies and everything was nowhere near what it had been, how it was dropping off every year, which caused a decline in sort of ticket sales and that sort of thing. Basically, the hype around Pokemon had faded down, but it didn't mean that it was over. Kind of looking back at the historical reaction is really funny at times, especially knowing where Pokemon is now compared to what the death of it was supposed to be 20 years ago. Monster Kids really is an excellent book about how Pokemon kind of dominated pop culture for a few years. I didn't remember many of the different TV shows and the merchandise and everything that's mentioned in here that was released around the time. The games were really the big draw for me. But hearing about all the different stuff that was kind of following around Pokemon and the things that, at least in my opinion, got mislabeled as being Pokemon clones was very interesting. It was also interesting to hear about which franchises didn't, or which parts of the franchises didn't make it over from Japan. Hearing about the different Digimon games, the ones that we didn't get, was very interesting to me. It kind of makes me a little upset that we didn't get them, but I'm sure there are probably like fan translations out there, because there are usually fan translations of certain games. After reading this, I can kind of see how Pokemon had more success than those other properties, especially with its multi-pronged approach to marketing and merchandising and everything, that a lot of these other franchises just did not have. Looking back at this period of video games and pop culture, it kind of made me nostalgic for some of the games. I went back and I looked at a bunch of the older Monster Rancher games that I have, and it kind of made me wish that Tecmo had, been able to find a way to get that series to continue. And really, that was kind of the only thing that I took away, was I really miss Monster Rancher. I really love those games an awful lot. There are a number of games that were kind of lumped in with Pokemon clones that I personally really love that don't seem to get the same recognition that at least I wish that they have. And they kind of get mislabeled as being Pokemon clones. One that's brought up in here is Jade Cocoon. And the only thing he does is say Jade Cocoon. He doesn't really talk anything more about it. But yeah, oh well. Basically, I really did enjoy this book. It's a great history of a period of time that kind of that means more to me now than it did back when I was actually living in it, if that really makes any sense. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. I think I've taken enough of your time today. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.